Hi, everybody. Ashawn Crawley coming to you live from my house again. I begin, as I always begin, by saying I hope that you all are well. I hope that your families and your friends are well. I hope that you are cared for and that you have opportunity, um, the opportunity to care for others, which is a great joy. To be able to outpour from yourself something into others is it's a gift to be able to give. um, and I think one thing that is becoming apparent all over the place in terms of the temporal disruption that we should be expecting. I've seen anywhere from May to June to 2021 to 2022. So things are very uncertain right now. And I think best case scenarios would have us at least until the end of this year socially distancing, which I kind of don't want to imagine what that is like. And so my hope is that that is not the case. But I'm also trying to look unflinchingly at the possibility of it in order to prepare mentally, to prepare emotionally, to prepare physically for what that would mean for me and what it would mean for you all as well. So thank you for joining me one more time. I really appreciate any of the folks who join and watch me ramble for a couple of minutes. I hope that it's useful. And even if it's not useful, I hope it's like some time to not think about things. And I will say that this video will be short. I've said that often, and I think it will be true this time, but let's see. Improvisation is the thing. For class tomorrow, for the folks in the class, we watched American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, which is about an hour and 25-minute documentary about the life of Grace Lee Boggs, an activist who lived in Detroit, Michigan, who sort of set up shop there with her husband and did a lot of great, great transformative work for folks in the city of Detroit. And so we watched the documentary featuring Grace Lee Boggs. And we also watched a very short, probably like 4-minute clip from Democracy Now! From 2010, April 2nd, of Grace Lee Boggs, just talking very quickly. And I want to just talk about some of the things that she says in the documentary, and then some of the things she says in the very short interview, and then we'll end. One of the things she says in the American Revolutionary documentary is that the moments that brought her to Detroit, she begins by talking about how living in Detroit is a forgotten, or how Detroit is a forgotten place, but how for her Detroit is this place that is gestating with possibility. I think this is really important just because often it is the marginal, often is the thing that is forgotten, often it is the thing that is erased that we think has no value. And it might not have value according to sort of political, economic, capitalist practices of value and valuation, but it doesn't mean that the practice lacks generativity, that the practice lacks in terms of what it can prompt in terms of imagination or transformation. Can it generate? Can it produce? Can something from it emerge? I think the answer is yes. And so what she begins by saying in this documentary is that Detroit is a forgotten place, but just because it's a forgotten place according to the national imaginary of what it means to be an important city, what it means to produce for the political economy of capitalist exploitation, does not mean that there isn't life that emerges from that place. That there's And what if we trained our attention towards the forgotten places? What if we trained our attention towards the places that are supposed to be nothing? What if we trained our attention towards the places that are from which nothing is supposed to emerge because we don't think there is no possibility there? There's no capacity for generativity in those supposed places. This is the question of sort of Black studies. This is the question of African American studies. This is the question of Africana studies. Black folks and Blackness is like a forgotten zone. There's this very important interview um, between Frank Wilderson, um, a, a philosopher of Black studies, and Saidiya Hartman, a Black feminist philosopher and rich thinker. And the interview is titled "The Position of the Unthought." And one of the major arguments in this interview is that Blackness is the zone of the thing that isn't thought, that where people refuse to actually think about Blackness. And so for me, it's very important to pay attention to the way Grace Lee Boggs discusses Detroit as a forgotten place, because in another sort of register, if we train our ear towards it differently, it could also be Detroit as the unthought, right? And we can think about lots and lots of cities, urban epicenters where lots and lots of Black folks live, where lots and lots of poor folks live. We can think of those as the place of the unthought. Detroit, Chicago, Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from, East Orange, but right next to Newark, New Jersey. There are so many places in our sort of popular imaginary that are forgotten places because of the sort of force of the political economy becoming a part of it, sort of extracting resources from it and then taking away, because of deindustrialization, resources for the city to thrive so that people can have jobs, for example. And so there are so many different ways that we can think of what Grace Lee Boggs talks about in terms of forgottenness. We can also think of in terms of the unthoughtness of these places and the people who live in those places. And so I really appreciate her speaking about the importance of Detroit, because it's such an important city for the ways we think about music, specifically Black music, the ways we think about transportation with cars, that if Detroit weren't a city, a lot of the ways that we think about our modes of transportation and the ways we think about what Black music are, those two things wouldn't be a thing, or would be a very different kind of thing if these sort of practices emerge from different kinds of cities. And so we can't forget the forgotten. And the people who live in the forgotten are still living and are still practicing and are still producing and are still loving. And so what we have to do is then be in solidarity with the forgotten, with the marginalized. One of the things that became apparent to me while watching this documentary is that the revolution that we have, the only revolution that we will ever have, is the revolution that is right under our feet. What do I mean? That the revolution that we have is not something that's to come, right? The revolution that we have, the capacity for transformation in our current moment, is only the things that we do in the current moment. That where you are, wherever you're watching this video, wherever you're listening to this video, that is the place where revolution happens. It's not going to happen somewhere far off. That we have to begin to think about revolutionary change, the capacity for transformation taking place in us personally, and it taking place in the places where we currently are. That the way we think about, or the way we imagine revolutionary capacity and transformation to happen as constantly being a futureward thing, or a thing that will happen in the future, is a deep sort of white supremacist understanding of time. It's a white supremacist understanding of space, and it's a white supremacist understanding of progress. That time doesn't have to move in a sort of linear forward progressing narrative, that time can be cyclical, that what happens with us, in us, is also revolutionary capacity and potential. And so I constantly want us to think about, how are we transforming our personal capacity from sort of the idea, from inertia into a certain kind, or from its potential into the kind of kinesthesia, into actual movement? How can we charge our imaginations in the direction of change? How can we charge our imaginations in the direction of transformation? How can we charge our imaginations in the direction of justice, equity, and care for the world? It's by beginning to practice that thing, not tomorrow, not 5 days from now, but beginning to practice that thing now. What I love about the documentary is how Grace Lee Boggs makes very clear that it was contact with Black people, by which I mean relationship with Black people, that was the grounds or the impetus for the revolutionary capacity that she would realize in herself. That when she begins to be in relationship with Black folks in Chicago, that's when she recognizes the necessity for struggling, becoming a co-struggler, or what some people call an ally, but I like the word co-struggler that my friend Mariam Kaba uses. To become a co-struggler in the cause of justice is when she began to be in relation with Black folks in Chicago. What that means to me, what that announces for me, is that relationship is deeply important for how we inhabit the world. We are not here on our own. We have to recognize that relationships are deeply transformative for our imaginative capacity, for what we imagine to be possible, and then what we put into practice in our day to day lives. And what Grace Lee Boggs recognized is that being in relationship with Black folks, folks who welcomed her to revolutionary struggle, is what prompted her imagination to say, there's something deeply wrong with this political economy, and I need to learn more about it, and I need to commit myself to working, to being a co-struggler with the folks who are deeply marginalized by this political economy that seems to be extracting from folks, and folks not being able to profit from the extraction from them. And so for me, I really want to encourage us, specifically in sort of this moment of intense crisis, in this moment of intense social distancing, to really, really think about, in a kind of careful and generous way, what relationship is, what relationship could be in a world where the biological fact of a virus is keeping us disconnected physically. What are some other ways that we can think about the practice of relation with one another that grounds that practice of relation in care as opposed to militarism, that grounds that practice of relationship in love as opposed to policing and violence? These are the things that I think are urgent, and these are the things that Grace Lee Boggs is really discovering as she's moving through these different places. She's moving from New York to Chicago, and then from Chicago to Detroit. She's recognizing the generative capacity of relationality. She also talks about it in terms of conversation, where she says that conversations are not these silly, frivolous things that are easily dispensable or discardable, or sort of things that we can sort of relinquish our relation to, but that conversation is the place, because they are improvisational. Conversation is a place where radical transformation can happen, not just from the one to the other, but for everyone who is engaging the conversation. It's a dialogical relationship. It's a relationship where everyone is constantly turning, where everyone is constantly sort of learning from one another, and they're struggling against one another in the conversation. But when they commit to being in conversation with one another, what happens is the transformation of the ones who have entered into conversation. And so relationship is deeply important to becoming a revolutionary, or not to becoming a revolutionary, but relationship is deeply important to revolutionary practice, and conversation is deeply important to revolutionary practice. I talked about this maybe 2 videos ago, in the language of friendship, where I think that friendship is deeply important for the ways that we enter into relation with one another, these anti-institutional modes of relationality that you have to figure out on a day-to-day basis. How am I going to be in relation to this other person? How am I going to be in relation with these other people? What are the rules by which we are going to engage each other? What are our morals? What are our ethics? How are we going to collectively produce something together in the service of a justice equity project? That's what the practice of friendship is. And it seems to me that what Grace Lee Boggs is showing us is revolutionary practice necessitates relationship, and it necessitates conversation. Conversation ain't about being right. Conversation is about the capacity for being in relation with one another, such that you are learning through the ongoing dialogue that you are having. And so it's not about proving that you are right and someone else is wrong. It's about committing to the struggle of the practice of being in dialogue with others. There's something very beautiful about that then, because it is about the thing that you make between, as opposed to, well, I'm a beautiful thing and you're a beautiful thing, and so let's just make beauty together. That's not what conversation is, and that's certainly not what relation is, and thus that's not what the practice of revolution is. The practice of revolution is the creation of the beautiful thing in the service of transformative justice, insofar as it is only the thing that you make when you commit to the making it together part. So making is such a deeply important practice that you must commit to, and revolutionary practice is produced through our capacity to be in relation with one another. One of the things that I really appreciated in the documentary is when they were talking about the sort of resistance that was taking place in Detroit in 1967, Grace Lee Boggs made a sharp distinction between the word riot and the word rebellion. Because when she was being interviewed, the person who interviewed her described it as a riot. And she responded and said, I don't think of it as a riot. I think of it as a rebellion. What this announces to me, and what I want to sort of think about you all with, is that the language that we use to describe things will tell us something about the ethics and the morals by which we will attempt to imagine the utility and the force of whatever the thing is that we're talking about. That the language that we use to describe things tells us a whole lot about who you think you are. And again, the question, who do I think that I am, is a question that is deeply urgent and important for Black studies. Who is the Black scholar? What is the role of the Black scholar? It's not to speak eloquently. It's not to use flowery words, even though you can do that. The purpose of the Black scholar, Vincent Harding tells us, is to speak truth. That's it. And so the point of speaking truth is that's what your role is. That's who you are. You are all you can do is the attempt to tell truth, right? And so the language that we use tells us something about what you think of as a truth claim. If you think of rebellion as riot, you tell us something about the truth, or you tell us something about your concept of what it means to engage in revolutionary struggle against a place, against a world that is constantly sort of marginalizing you as a Black person. And so what she tells us when she tells us to use the language of rebellion as opposed to riot is that we find out if something is worth celebrating or dispensing with based on the language that you use. The language of riot means that we're supposed to dispense with the revolutionary capacity for transformation that the behavior or the action actually is supposed to engage. And the language of rebellion tells us that perhaps, because rebellion means you are reacting against something that is acting forcefully and violently against you. You are rebelling against it. You are rebelling against something that is more powerful than you. And so that tells us that to use the word rebellion is, for me, a celebratory cause, because it says that there is something in us, people who are being marginalized by the state, for example, that we have, that we can cultivate, that we can cherish, and that we can use to act against the ones who are acting violently against us. Language is deeply important then. It's also like during Hurricane Katrina, when people were taking things from stores, toilet paper, paper towels, for example. The language of looting is often used, right? And the language of looting, it was like documented, was racialized. Whenever Black folks were taking things from stores, it was called looting, which meant they were stealing. And it meant they were stealing and they were just trying to take TVs, and they didn't care about anything except for their luxury. But if it was non-Black people who were doing things like that, they were called taking things or meeting their needs or attempting to meet their needs. And so the language that we use is deeply important because it tells us about the guiding ethic, the moral, the guiding principle of the one who is speaking. And so these things are really important. One of the things Grace Lee Boggs says is, quote, "The radical movement has overestimated the role of activism and underestimated the role of reflection," end quote. I thought this is really important, and I want to think about you, or I want to think about it with you all tomorrow when we talk, because I think what she is trying to say is something similar to what I've been trying to say, but I think she says it with a greater precision than I do. That we valorize identity. So the role, or we valorize the identity of a thing. So, like activists as identity, we overestimate its potential. What is this identity going to give me? What is it going to gift me in the world? And we underestimate what she says is reflection, or for me, I would say the capacity for imagination or thought, or really being in deep thought, not as an individual project, not as like a thing that you do as an individual subject by yourself alone, but reflection as the mode of conversation that is produced through relation that you have with others. That we underestimate the practice of relationality that allows for deep thought to happen as a practice of imagining worlds with one another, because we think of thinking and we think of imagination as frilly or frivolous things that are easily discardable. And we think that what's really important is action, because we think imagination and we think thought are not action. What Grace Lee Boggs is saying is that actually thinking is action and imagination is action, and that these things are not unimportant and they are not uninspired, but they are really, really important to sustaining revolutionary capacity, because you end up wondering, well, what is it that I'm fighting for in the first place? What is the world that I want to create? If all I'm ever doing is being against something, I forget about the things that I am in favor of. What is the kind of world that I want to build with other people? And how can I imagine what that other kind of world is? And so what Grace Lee Boggs is saying, that if we take the emphasis off of identity in terms of like the concept of activist, and we put more emphasis on the capacity of relationality through which conversation and thus thought happens, perhaps we can recalibrate ourselves in such a way that we can see or we can sense the necessity of the ways we can re-engage one another in a sort of revolutionary capacity towards transformation. Once we lay all of our sort of emphasis in identity, we lose our capacity for personal transformation, because then we do everything we can to defend our identity. I'm an activist, and so anything that I do must be revolutionary because I'm an activist. Activists do good things, and so my identity as activist then inoculates me and leaves me protected from any mode of critique or engagement, because guess what? My identity protects me from you saying anything negative about the things that I'm doing. That's not cool. And so if we overemphasize the identity of the activist as opposed to the practice of reflection, we lose our capacity for deep critical deep self-critical engagement, and also critical engagement of others. And so I really appreciate that she makes this distinction, insofar as the distinction is one between identity and practice. And so for me, I don't care about this. Is why I sort of self-corrected myself at the very beginning when I talked about being a revolutionary. I'm not interested in being a revolutionary. I'm interested in revolutionary practice. I'm not interested in being a queer person. I'm interested in Black queer practice. I'm not interested in being a Christian. I'm not. I'm interested in Black Christian practice. I'm interested in practice because practice tells us something more urgent than the thing that we lay claim to called identity, which is supposed to be this coherent, stable thing that is unchanging, which we know ain't the truth. It's not coherent, stable, and unchanging because we, people of the flesh, all of us, we are incoherent, we are unstable, and we are constantly changing. Like, that's the way that our flesh actually operates. And so because we're constantly changing, what if we honor the fact of who we are as like creatures in this world or on this earth as constantly in flux and flow? It means then that we can take emphasis off of the concretized concept of identity and ask, what is your practice? Because I think that's more interesting and I think that's more urgent. I don't care what you describe yourself as, but I do care. What do you do? What are your practices? Who are you in conversation with? Why do you think the things that you do and you say are important? Who is it that drives you? What is it that drives you? These are the questions that are sort of animating Black studies. The question of identity is one that seems urgent under a very specific political economy of capitalist exploitation. The question of practice is the one that I'm committed to. How are you practicing justice? How are you practicing joy? How are you practicing relationship? How are you practicing conversation? How are you practicing friendship? These are the things that I think we should really think about. Democracy Now! On April 2nd, 2010, had a very short sort of segment where Grace Lee Boggs was speaking, and there were two things that she said that I think are important for us. The first one is similar to what I've been saying, but again, she says it with more clarity and precision than I did, or than I do. And she said it long before I did. But quote, "Another world is necessary, another world is possible, and another world is happening." Right? End quote. We can't end with the idea that another world is necessary, because saying that is insufficient on its own. And we can't end with another world is possible, because saying that by itself is insufficient. We also have to recognize the third aspect, that another world is happening, right? That if you desire for another world to happen, you have to make it happen. Again, it ain't some future thing. Revolutionary practice ain't going to be something that comes to you whole. It has to be the thing that you attempt to do right now. And so another world is not only possible, another world is not only necessary, but another world is also happening right now. And so the question is, what are you doing? Who are you being? How are you practicing in this other world that is happening right now? Right? That is the urgent question that you have to ask yourself. What have you committed yourself to? Because if you've committed yourself to the normative concepts that govern the normative world, then how can you practice revolutionary capacity in the another world that is happening right now? You are breaking with the other world that is happening in order to remain committed to the strictures of the normative world, because you have committed yourself to the normative world and its practice. So you can't have it both ways. You either have to engage in something in the direction of revolutionary capacity and practice, not identity, but practice, by relinquishing the normative world, or you with a stranglehold hold on to the normative world, but you can't do both. And so I really appreciate Grace Lee Boggs saying for us that another world is necessary. Yes, we understand that. Another world is possible. Yes, we understand that, sort of in a kind of abstract way, right? But another world is possible. Another world is possible, and another world is happening. Well, what does that mean? And for me, I think we have to do what I've been trying to do in our course, which is listen to the music, listen to what Black music presents us as another world happening in our now world. This is what DJs do. This is why I think Ninth Wonder is so really important, because what Ninth Wonder is doing is showing us with a certain kind of clarity what another world is happening sounds like. This is why I showed y'all the folks dancing in the Baltimore club and the girl with the red hair, right? Because they were practicing another world is happening in this here and now world. This is why I show y'all clips of like church folks, because church folks are the practice of another world happening in the normative world right now. That does not mean that we cannot critique or should not critique the other worlds that we are producing with one another. It just means that the normative world is one world amongst many. And how can we recognize the practice of alternatives such that we can interrogate the practice of the normative, and also use the ways that we interrogate the practice of the normative world in order to be a tool and a resource with which we engage the otherwise practices as well? Because if those otherwise practices are not in the service of justice, equity, love, and care, then those otherwise practices also then need to be relinquished or let go of. And so I appreciate Grace Lee Boggs saying that. The last thing that was said in that clip that I think is important for us is, quote, "The only way to survive is by taking care of one another, by recreating our relationships to one another." We are at a critical moment. I mean, we are seeing now the necessity for caring for one another. We watched the video of Dean Spade and Mariam Kaba being interviewed by Democracy Now, where they talked about mutual aid. Mutual aid being important because we recognize that the state lacks the capacity to care for us. What the state does do is practice militarization and policing on us. It doesn't practice care, though. And so what we recognize is the urgency, and this was recorded in 2010, Grace Lee Boggs, but it's so urgent for our now moment, 20 years later, like almost to the day, April 2nd, we're at April 15th, that there's an urgency with which we must practice care with one another and redefine our relationships with one another, because the normative ways that we've understood relationality has been deeply damaging to our emotions. It's been deeply damaging to our capacity for being in relation to one. This is why we read The Color Purple. And this is why I keep talking about the character Harpo. His desire for being a normative man meant his relinquishing of his deep love and relationship and care for his wife, Sophia. That once he wanted to be a real man, he relinquished his capacity for deep care, and he relinquished his capacity for deep joy. That he had to really redefine his relationship to patriarchy before he could really again discover his loving relationship with Sophia. And so there's so many different ways that we recognize that, or that we come to find, that we come to sense that what is urgent for our now moment is a full redefinition of who we think we are, who we think we are becoming, right? That we have to unsettle the coloniality of our being, which is a title of a wonderful, amazing essay by a theorist who we watched earlier this semester named Sylvia Wynter. She has an essay titled Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, and Freedom. That there is a way that we have, that our minds, our being, who we think we are, has been colonized by white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, or through Western concepts of what it means to be a man and a human. And so we have to really, really unsettle who it is that we think we are, who it is that we think we're becoming. We have to really reach in the direction of and really struggle toward a redefinition of who our relation, or what our relationships are with one another. All that to say, 35 or almost 35 minutes later, sorry, y'all. Otherwise, it's possible. The concepts by which we govern ourselves in this normative world are deeply insufficient for our lives and our relations. And we have to struggle to make apparent the practice of otherwise. We have to struggle to make apparent the alternatives that are already happening in our world. And then we must struggle with those alternatives to ensure that they are too in the service of justice, equity, love, and care. And I want to end with something that I sent to a friend in a text message just now. There has to be more than this. And this is like my old Black Pentecostal preaching days coming back, perhaps. But I believe that there has to be more than this. And I don't mean heaven. I mean that there has to be more in this world that is available for us in terms of our capacity to care for one another today. That there has to be more than what we've been told we can do. There has to be more than what we've been told we can be. There has to be more than what we've been told we can practice in relation with one another. I know that there has to be. And I know that there has to be because I have friends. And I know that there has to be because I have love. And if I can have it, friends and love, and other people have friends and love, then I know that we can ground our relationships, not with militaristic violence, not with policing, but with care and love as the core central tenets by which we engage. I know it's possible. And I know it's possible because it has already been practiced with me. So I know that there has to be more than this. And this in this situation is the normative world. There has to be more than this. I believe it deeply, in a metaphysical, spiritual way, in a mystical way. I believe that there has to be more than this, because the world that we have been given and the way that it governs us is by its own desire to interrupt our attachments to one another the attachments of care, love, joy, and pleasure. And it attempts to do that. And because we want to be normal, we let it. We have to let it go. I'm convinced of that. And so I'm committed to the idea that there is more than this because it has been practiced as a practice of friendship and care. And it's a part of the Black radical tradition. The idea that there is more than this is the reason why Maroons escaped plantations, literally, and lived in the swamp because they said there's something more than this. And even if that is dangerous, I'd rather that than live in this, right? And so the practice of otherwise, the practice of alternatives does not mean the practice of safety, but it does mean the practice of care, right? That care doesn't often or always have to mean safe, but care can mean, or what the practice of otherwise can mean is the practice of care, the practice of joy, right? They expose themselves to the violence of the world by escaping the so-called safe place of the plantation into the non-safe place of the swamp, of the woods. That by exposing themselves, they actually practice a form of radical care for themselves and the ones that they are escaping with. And so it's not the antithesis of the capacity for violent things to happen to you. And it's not the antithesis or the protection from dangerous things happening or heartbreaking things happening. It just means that you recognize that there is something more fundamental and urgent about the practice of the alternative than there is about the capacity to stay where you are in the normative when the normative itself is wreaking havoc and violence on you anyway, right? And so for me, I want to end on the idea that there has to be more than this. And I hope that you all try to explore that with me, and with your families and with your friends, and try to figure out otherwise modalities for us to exist in the world. I wish you care. I wish you love, joy, and I wish you peace today and every day. Thank you.